Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the June 29th, 2011 Zeitgeist Movement Global Radio Show. Hope everyone's doing well out there. I'm going to be talking live for the next hour and a half with you. We have a great guest, Dr. John McMurtry of the University of Guelph in Canada, who will be joining us in about 15 minutes. But before that, I wanted to run down a number of things that have been happening that are developments, that exciting things, in fact, that are going on. The first issue is the Zeitgeist Media Festival, which we have finally launched with available tickets. The one in LA is basically ready to go. There are still developments that are working, but it's looking to be like a very exciting event, and I'm really happy to see the response that's happened so far from both a commercial sense, meaning those that are active in the commercial industry that are willing to kind of breach over to such a seemingly radical concept as far as what it's advocating. If those that aren't familiar with this, please go to zeitgeistmediafestival.org and look at what we're doing with that. That should be a great public awareness event. Lots of stuff going on with that, tremendous development, so I'm really happy to see that. The main event, of course, is during the weekend of the 9th, the 11th in September. The main event is on that Sunday. And there will be mirrored events all over the world. We have a number of them in Canada and Oregon that have already started to pop up. And I noticed actually a lot of other people have already been promoting their own media festivals out there without submitting it to our main site for our own publication. So please make sure that if you have an event you're doing, go to zeitgeistmediafestival.org and let us know so we can post it and promote it for you, and also get you in touch with other elements of it. For example, the local food drives. We're trying to make a network of food drives or even clothes drives, if that's in your interest. Resource-based drives as opposed to monetary or fundraising drives. In Los Angeles, where the main event is a tremendous homeless homeless population and many people starving. And, of course, it's getting increasingly worse for reasons that, everyone should know, as that's what we talk about. So this is our attempt to try and bridge basic community grassroots activism along with our broader view, of course, which is everything that we advocate regarding a new economic model where these things don't exist. The town halls. We had our first town hall in Los Angeles. We considered that the main event was kind of a kickoff. There really is no such thing as a main event town hall. It's all regional. I've gotten many different responses from it, which have been very positive. We're going to have a full video of the 2-hour session with the Q&A online very soon, with the edited slideshows, the presentations that were given. And there are many other town halls that have emerged. I was hoping to have a list actually today of the town halls that were happening in different places, but I was unable to have time to find that and organize that, But there are about 5 or 6 going on. That went on, actually July, I think there's 5 or 6. I think there were 2 or 3 that went on in June. For those of you that are doing the town halls, please make a point to record it and post it. That's very, very important to keep this going and to make it publicly known and to instill confidence for others that might, have a small chapter, but they are not yet confident to have it when they see others do it. It really helps to boost that confidence so they can gain ideas. So please post those things on your video blogs and on your main sites when you do those events. It's very, very important. Structural issues, the orientation guide update and the PDF and the video. This is happening. I am in the midst of a lot of different research to revise these things. It's obviously going to be pulled from the majority of the lectures that we have already. We have there's new train of thought approaches to this as opposed to what we were doing prior, which was sort of a blanket reference to the Venus Project. It's actually a very positive issue with this because it enables a more critical analysis of this approach, this social approach, rational social approach, and this ground-up kind of life sequence of value type of notion to segue into John McMurtry, as that is one of his staple comments. The life ground issue, if you will. It's a very important notion. This was covered, of course, in Zeitgeist Moving Forward, and it's in numerous lectures as well. So that's coming along, and hoping that within the next week or 2 at the latest, those will be updated and out there. And I think it's going to be a big positive development because so many things have occurred since our original orientation materials were created, and new language has been approached, very straightforward methods of getting to the core of things as opposed to a lot of verbiage that tends to exist in those materials. Good to hone in, and that's what's happening, which I'm actually excited to see. The newsletter, press release, blog. This is in our This is actually commented on, featured, in fact, in our new newsletter, the June newsletter, which is now out. You can download it at the zeitgeistmovement.com, and an email, bulk email, was sent out as well where that can be downloaded. And I want to thank everybody, Brandy and Federico, and everybody that were putting this together. And we're also going to be launching a site, a blog site, where people can contribute to the newsletter press release team in a very active way. And it's the best thing that we've come up with so far, and I really want to thank everybody that's been working on that. That hasn't officially launched, but it will soon, and that will enable anyone to interact and create more of a community environment when it comes to news allocation. Eventually, I want to do RSS feeds for important news, social breakdown news, social development news as far as technology, and have that go straight into the zeitgeistmovement.com, along with any other sites that want to have that RSS. It's very critical that we keep news flowing, because every day something new seems to materialize that reinforces exactly what we talk about, inevitably. So that's a great thing. We're also doing massive site revisions. The zeitgeistmovement.com is undergoing a huge facelift and structural reorganization as far as how people will interact with it, how information flow will work. So what you're seeing there right now is relatively temporary, even though we continue to try and clean it up. But that's going to be very good when that finally comes through. And one final note, there's the Venus Project, as everyone knows, has been the technical think tank for a long time, and still very much is as a frame of reference, just like Buckminster Fuller's ideas are in a frame of reference, just as Nikola Tesla's ideas are in a frame of reference and social approach, and even people like more of a philosophical standpoint like Carl Sagan about what it means to apply science to society, even in the context of a spiritual notion. Carl was very beautiful about that, to show how the connection to the cosmos, if you will, can be very much a spiritual notion. It doesn't have to be some cold issue or, the old cold science notion. These are things that really have to be pushed forward and pushed out of the way, if you will, so people can really appreciate what we've come to with our advancement of knowledge. It wasn't that long ago that we maintained a heavy superstitious bias towards our view of reality, and within the past, I'd say, well, on and off within the past, 1,000 years, we had the great Ionian Greek Renaissance, and then we slammed into the Dark Ages. All the great research was destroyed in the Library of Alexandria, and then slowly the Renaissance came back, and we've permeated, finally getting this scientific worldview out there, and it's a really important thing to try and maintain, especially in a world that's still saturated in some tremendously despairing and decoupled beliefs. And that's not an opinion. That's very much a reality. And I think it's going to be a rude awakening for many out there that kind of choose to look the other way with respect to the scientific approach and maintain dogmatic, economic, or even religious views. So the awakening will happen one way or another. I just think it's sad to see how much suffering might occur before it does, before people are willing to look beyond politics and the dogmas of economics as we know it, and everything else. But nevertheless, these things are developing, and this worldview that I speak of is where this think tank that I've described before, it's an applied solutions think tank, which basically replaces the Venus Project as a data source. It builds upon it, doesn't replace it. This is a limitation of language here. But ultimately, it's to get a community environment where we can start to think about a revision of society in an applied method. And I mentioned this a number of broadcasts back, but a nonprofit will be founded for this. And as it develops in a Google API form, an online form, in other words, we're going to be using map structures and different forms of problem-solving techniques in a community method. We will begin to have annual events. We already have a number of annual events already, but this will be a very proactive method to do so, targeted only towards technical revision. We talk a lot about society and values, and all that stuff kind of comes into play after the technical applications and scientific awarenesses are there. So that's going to be a big thing, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because, well, it's a monstrous subject, and it's going to take a tremendous amount of work, probably the largest project that the Zeitgeist Movement will undertake, apart from our general social work and trying to change the values, to really begin to apply modern methods to the environment around us in a technical way is what needs to be done. And I think, beyond the controversy of whatever might be associated with the movement or anything else, if we can show the world the technical solutions on a region-by-region basis, that is really where it stands. And the moment people realize the technical solutions, well, inevitably their values will adapt. And that's important. And the trick, of course, is to get that information out there to show the solution before a certain level of panic sets in. I always watch the covers of all the newspapers and the debt collapse, the fears of energy, all these things that we've talked about for so long are really beginning to permeate out there. And, well, that is what it is. That's where the biosocial pressures come from. So eventually the tipping point will occur, and that is where we hope to be properly positioned, where we can actually show something that people can grasp and hold on to and move forward with and inform their fellow man about, and inevitably avoid the great problems that are on the horizon. So let's see. I think I've covered almost all the news that I think is relevant, but please check back the newsletter press release site. We'll have an email blast for that as well. The Zeitgeist Media Festival, if you have one out there, please send it to it's mediafestival@thezeitgeistmovement.com, mediafestival@thezeitgeistmovement.com. And, of course, the town halls, that's a very critical operation. So please make sure you document those thoroughly, you get them online. And once a month is a great thing to do it. If you still don't have an audience for it, where it's even 5 or 6 people, at least generate a discussion. This type of courage to engage the public in a very live way is extremely important. The internet does what it does, but at the end of the day, people need a more visceral interaction. And when they see other people doing things, they get more confidence, and then critical mass can be developed. And that's really all we can hope for in the end, frankly. We talk a lot about the political system. We talk a lot about why the political system is self-serving, why it frames itself in a way that protects itself, in a way that kind of cancels out anything that challenges the basic foundation, of course, which is monetary economics. We see that the political structure is an extension of the economic structure. It pretty much has to be. And the economic structure, again, has nothing to do with nature or resources or anything. It's about blind cyclical consumption and a lot of things that we're going to talk about with Dr. John McMurtry when he calls in here in a moment. But to give an overview of John McMurtry, as many might have seen the social pathology lecture I did in the Zeitgeist Day 2010. Roughly 25% of that was taken from his book, The Cancer Stage of Capitalism, and I sourced it there. And it's a very important work. John has written about 16 literary works, if I remember correctly. He is the moral philosopher at the University of Guelph in Canada, and I think his most defining work is probably The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. I think it's one of the oldest associations of scientists and scholars, a very objective association. And he was featured in Zeitgeist Moving Forward, very much highlighted, and just a really tremendous mind. If anyone's ever read his works, he has a very deep grasp of language and communication, and he really cuts to the bone of what really the problem is, and is very much beyond the pale, if you will, and absorbs a great deal of heat, just like many of us do, and his courage, though, to move forward in the way he has with his writings and his activism is truly, truly phenomenal. So I'm going to be patching him in 1 second here. Hold on one moment. John, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Peter.
Hey, it's great to speak with you again. How are you?
You as well.
Yes.
I'm fine.
Excellent. Well, I'm finally got a little technical glitches out of the way, and I'm really pleased to have you here. And I was just giving a general introduction of yourself and your works and everything that you've done and your activism and, of course, your courage. That's something that you probably don't get very often. But as we'll discuss in the questions that we've prepared, this system tends to want to counteract anybody that, that anyone attempts to challenge any attribute of it, and it manifests itself in many different ways. So I want to applaud you for your courage to stand strong in a world where pretty much everything's against us, that are trying to seek a more sustainable approach to society. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, you're right. The selective pressures against really any principle that you stand for that conflicts with the in our time, the ultimately regulating private money sequences becoming more money. any place that you stand against that, even if you stand against certain of the, which you yourself have perceived in the case of Descartes, iconic figures inside the history of human thought and philosophy, it's really quite remarkable, even within the academy itself, the selective pressures against it.
Yeah, exactly. You made a great point in your great work, The Cancer Stage of Capitalism, about Socrates and the slavery that existed, and this was considered normality during that time. So, and it makes us all wonder all the things that we take for granted in the current time that we'll look back in the future and say, wow, what were we thinking, you know?
I often have that, and I've had that vision for many, many years of just what would, if you were to drop in from 100 years hence, and indeed I try to write from that perspective of what will it seem like reading this 100 years hence, and try to be into that meaning space to understand, because one is so conditioned, so pervasively conditioned by the systems to acceptance of it and validation of it, that really it does, that is a thought that is indeed with me all the time, is how inconceivable will it be to any future, if there is a future, that it could be so systematically life blind at every level, so that the very ultimate and universal life support systems that we depend upon, from the hydrological cycles to biodiversity to the quality of food and so forth, that it just doesn't matter. It doesn't compute to this framework of understanding that has been so instituted, and virtually anything that has stood in its way or conflicted with it at the social level, for example, a society with an alternative system, has been attacked, and indeed, one might say, genocided, culturally and often physically, for standing for or representing any alternative structure to it. That's something that's been going on since biblical times, and certainly has been going on with the latest God, which is, it's a theo-capitalist system. And so we really do wonder, at what point will there be the Great Awakening to actually what a completely systematically life-destructive this system is that is presupposed a priori.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I think the community that we work with, we just hope that it doesn't have to get too bad before the majority of people on this planet do awaken, where we don't pass the point of no return, as they say.
Well, this is really the problem, is that one wonders, I think a lot of people secretly, this of course doesn't go on in the corporate media as to this, the situation that we're now in, and people have been intuiting increasingly that it had, possibly it has become cumulatively irreversible. And each turning point that we come to, and we came to a great turning point in 2008, a wonderful turning point at one level in terms of how bad things can get before they get better. The whole financial system, which is behind our problem most of all, it's the ultimate causal determinant of it, that when the whole financial system collapses at the center with Wall Street, and that, it was around people's homes, and you just thought, this is the time that the reforms that have been needed for so long can come in. You take away Wall Street's ability to print all the money through debt, having basically debt creation of money, and you have homes now, since Wall Street and since all these derivative financial functions can no longer manage it for their private profit. Then we are now going to lend money to people's homes. You've lost it. You can't do the job. You've blown the shop. You've shown yourself incompetent at the level that you think is most important, that is a market economy. You've failed completely. Now we easily pass, and it really could have happened, just said, well, we're taking over the loan of, home loans for people, and we're going to do it in the way it used to be done. We're going to be doing it by the need of people and their ability to pay back over time, and we're not going to charge compounding interest. And it's just going to return to the public domain. Is so much of which, has gone wrong is because it's been taken out of the public domain. And, this was especially post-war and so forth, that it had moved into the public domain. And we resolved the housing problem. We resolved the compounding money debt through these instruments that they have that nobody can understand, that completely hollows them out as people and financially to carry the debt load, which they can't. And they thought this was securitization, that this was the way of guaranteeing their loans. And then at the same time, we can resolve this financial problem and the housing problem, speaking very ad hoc, very specifically, addressing directly the problem, addressing directly the failures, and we move on from there. But of course, as we know, that didn't happen. The failed system was bailed out to the tune of now over $20 trillion worldwide, and all the countries of the world, or many countries of the world, are now paying the piper for all this giveaway of the money, public money, to bail out this failed system. So we did have the turning point. We did have things have gotten really worse. We had gotten it to the point of complete financial collapse. We had the alternative before us. We had it completely relevant to our situation, and of course it just it failed at the central and the leading level. And of course we know why. Is because Obama and the presidency itself was basically a brand change, and the presidency itself is controlled by Wall Street and the large corporations who have really no concern about the American people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Hence what you refer to as the cancer stage of capitalism.
Well, yes, I know. People, I originally came out with this concept. I was asked by a public health journal from the United States, centered in San Francisco, and this public health journal asked me to write they were doing a special issue, and asked me to write an article about how I understood, and this was back in the 1990s, how I understood the problems that we were going through and how it connected to public health. And it was at that point that I was prompted to follow through on an intuition I'd had, is that this system is behaving very much like a cancer, a carcinogenic circuitry at the social level of life organization. And actually, the people who were refereeing the paper were actually medical people, and there was a lot of resistance to taking it from, I'm saying this isn't a metaphor, this isn't imagery. The image is good, but it's much deeper than that. Just as we have laws of physics that operate at different levels of reality, across life organization and across entities that aren't alive and so forth, so we can have laws within life organization that operate in the same way. And then if we start to consider what are the hallmark characteristics, the defining characteristics of a reproduction and the invasion of a carcinogenic circuit, and the more one got into that and then brought it to the social level of life organization, that is, it isn't cellular, it isn't genetically determined, it is at another level of life organization. So it isn't as if I'm having an organic metaphor that some people might understand it, well, I'm seeing society as an organism. No, I'm seeing it as a social life organization. That means it isn't determined by genetic circuits. It's determined by ultimately value systems and social value systems, not individual value systems. They're usually derivative from the social value system. Exactly. And then if you have at the social level of life organization, if you have a reproduction circuit that's growing and it's growing exponentially, once you see exponential growth, you see carcinogenic possibility. There's something gone wrong. And if you see that growth, and of course what it is, in place of what we call the cancer sequence, what it always does is reproduce itself, really the not self of the body. It reproduces cancer cells, which are deformed and don't have any committed function to the life host. And that's the real key. There's no committed function to the life host. Now, these money sequences, these private money sequences, seek only, like a cancer, they seek only to multiply themselves without inhibition, and they have no committed function to the life host. Well, of course, that ends up in disaster, and that's what happens at the bodily level, and that's what happens at the social level. We have not been able to impose any committed function to life host requirements of life. For example, say with the climate destabilization, that we reduce our carbon. It does. They'll just turn it into another money sequencing to turn into more money without inhibition. And the key is not only that it doesn't have any committed function to the life host, it isn't recognized by the surrounding community. Now, in the body level, the surrounding cell community, it's cells, and they recognize. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable thing. The way we all have cancer going on in our bodies all the time. There are cancers there. But the social immune system is able to recognize the cancer. And that's the big problem, is not only that you have a cancer growing and multiplying without committed function, but you also have no recognition at the surrounding life level of what has gone wrong. In fact, it recognizes these cancer cells, which is just money sequencing becoming more private money without limit until it dominates everything. There's no recognition of it. And of course, what's happened there is that the corporate mass media are in fact part of the cancer. And of course, Wall Street is at the very center of the propagation of the cancer. And they are not going to allow any recognition. It's inconceivable to them. They're behaving like a cancer, but it's inconceivable to them that they could possibly recognize this. And so it isn't recognized by the surrounding social immune system. Now, our social immune system at the social level of life organization isn't. I mean, I could go into the mechanics that go on at the bodily level. It's really quite amazing. What happens is that you have macrophage cells that recognize that there's something wrong, and they, so to speak, and they tear the genetic marker off the cell, the rogue cell, and they display it to the surrounding cell community, and then there's a response, a biochemical response that triggers into action precisely the antibody, precisely the action of the body to get rid of those cells. And those are called T cells from the thymus gland. And one could go through it, how it's just really quite miraculous how this happens. But the key when it happens is that you recognize that it is a cancer. And I've had cancer myself, and that was the most difficult thing was getting the body to recognize the growth and come after it. But that hasn't happened. So it then just continues to attack all our life means support systems to reproduce itself at higher and higher levels of multiplication, and it appropriates ever more of the life host nutriments for its own growth, and then it unlimitedly multiplies its own non-productive demands of growth, and that's what they're always saying, we must have growth, we must have growth. It's just the cancer meta program has entered into the very command posts of the social system. And so then you have the needs and goods, therefore, of the life hosts are displaced at every level, whether your food is has carcinogenic components, or you're not managing any level of the climate reproduction system or whatever. It just keeps on taking over those, like, for example, the carbon credit fraud that has been going on. It just, what it does is repeat the money sequence reproduction and multiplication every time it faces a problem. Then it metastasizes across the life host, across borders, and that's really what these so-called free trade, basically, it's the free movement of private money sequences to control everything across the planet and across borders. And so it eventually exhausts by the deprivation and the dysfunction, it exhausts the life host, and that's the stage we're in now.
Yeah, absolutely. You've made the comment.
So it's not a metaphor.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree. And I think, for example, the community that you're speaking with is our hope to be the social immune system, or one of many attributes of it, to rise up against this before it's too late. You've used the term money sequence a few times. For the listeners that aren't familiar, would you define money sequence versus the life sequence? Yeah, well,
this all, became, it has more generic application, but because you could have a money sequence, I suppose, that was instrumental to the life sequence. But let me just go through the life sequence of value first. It's very, very simple and straightforward. It's just basically you have a life host or you have a life structure, and that or life means, but whatever form of life it is, it goes through means of life. It must have means of life. We must breathe every second, and we must have water and so forth. It must have means of life to become more life, that is, to continue as life and to, at best, biodiversify and become more intelligent at the human level. And so the life sequence is just life through means of life to more life through means of life, at the best, not only to reproduction, but more flourishing life, more, and then I really get into what all that means, but we don't need to do that right now, but basically it's thought, action, and felt side of being, and it becomes more flourishing life. So we have life through means of life to more life, and that circuit reproduces itself forever. I mean, that's really, from the primitive protoplasm to now.
Right.
Now what we have is a money sequence that happens. Well, it's happened really through civilized societies to some extent. That we've had this money sequence, and it's private. That is, it's only for private owners, and they turn money through life as means into more money for themselves to do it more money, returning themselves to more money, to more money, to more money, and that becomes the money sequence of value. So you could have the exchange medium as we have in the ordinary, the market, the traditional market, where people, they're direct producers, sell their organic food and handicrafts, and it's the labor of those who own and sell it. And it's, it's basically labor intensive, and it's local individuals with their personal knowledge and so on. And you have money that acts as an exchange medium between their product and someone's purchase of it for their own lives. At that point, money is not a problem. Money is actually very useful for people to convert what they can do into what others can do for them through an exchange medium. But what happens with the money sequence of value, it ceases to be an exchange medium for exchange of means of life for people to produce for one another and to have the means of life they require and have the means of exchange available to them. It changes into sheer money multiplication. It has no life function. It doesn't even, and the real cancer stage started happening when it no longer needed anything of concrete life value or anything of value at all as a middle term. It just turns, this is the derivative moment, it turns money into more money for private money possessors without doing anything, without providing any function. And of course that's gotten into the level of just, trillions and trillions of dollars a day are being manufactured in this way, where they have no committed function, they produce nothing whatsoever. So that's the money sequence that takes off as autonomous and exponentially multiplying, serves no function whatsoever, but is only evaluated on how much money it returns to its private possessors. And that's the only objective going. And that's called growth. And that's called profit returns. And that is affirmed even as it eats away the body of the society.
Well, let me extend that question a little bit, because you touched upon the market system. Obviously, you viewed the work that you participated in, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, and there's a series of critiques that are made to the market system as being intrinsically inefficient in kind of a very fundamental way. For instance, we have the application of cost efficiency, where a corporation needs to cut corners to produce so it can compete with other corporations that are cutting corners. And do you feel that such flaws in the ability to produce what you could consider correctly in a scientific way being inhibited by the need to preserve and cut back on cost efficiency? Do you feel that those components are problematic?
I think you're going to the heart of the matter with saying there's something deranged in what we're counting as a cost here.
Right.
And you're seeing one of the manifestations of the deranged notion of cost, and one of the manifestations is that you don't have long-lasting goods, for example, perfected goods, because you want to have a market that you can keep continuing to sell to, and you want to have it sold for a low cost for maximum profit, and so forth. I agree with all that, but the problem is deeper in the very notion of cost itself. Cost itself only means in this system, I'm talking about high theory economics, I'm talking about Samuelson's text of economics, virtually everything you see written on so-called economics is really diseconomics, is that cost simply means cost to investor. That means money cost to money sequencers. That's how you decode it. All they mean by cost is money cost to money sequencers. And they want to reduce money cost to money sequencers, and they want to amplify, produce as much possible of money returns or revenues over cost. But it's always only in money terms within the private money self-multiplying sequence, money sequence. And so if you understand cost in that way, then not only are you going to have the problem that you've identified, you're going to have problems at every level because you don't count any life costs in.
Right.
It's absolutely life blind. So you don't count the cost. Well, supposing we sell this junk food, for example, and it causes all these problems with obesity and so on, cancer, through all the carcinogens and so forth. Well, that just doesn't compute to the system. All it is concerned about, all it tracks, all it thinks in terms is, does the money of the investor, is the cost for the money cost for producing a money profit, is that as low as possible? End of story. So what happens to the labor? Doesn't matter. What happens to the consumer? Doesn't matter. What happens to the ecosystem? Doesn't matter. What happens to culture? Doesn't matter. It is structurally life blind. It excludes all costs from view. The only cost it takes into account is the money cost to the private money sequencer. End of story. So this predictably leads to the sorts of crises we've had over time. Nature is wonderfully resourceful and people are wonderfully able to carry on. But eventually, cumulatively over time, if you pay absolutely no attention to any cost but how much, the money costs to private money sequencers, then virtually everything that should be being counted in is going to be destroyed. It's going to be cumulatively destroyed, and it's going to be so predictably. It's predictable in principle, and of course we just have confirmation of that happening all around us in all sorts of places that we hadn't thought to look, but that's what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And another element of that life cost, which is the same fundamental inefficient train of thought on the life ground level, but yet efficient for the market system, is this sort of self-preservation of dominant institutions, where you'll have institutions that strategically limit efficiency or stifle competition, if you will, something that might be a better good or service, something that might be more sustainable even, because sustainability very often is the enemy of a consumption system that we have today.
Right.
So you have this it's paralyzed. So scientific inquiry, development of renewable energies, obviously, which we could have done a long, long time ago, it's stifled. And I think that's another extension of that. Would you agree?
Yes, indeed. But I would say, and when we go to which institutions are, preserved and multiplied and which institutions aren't, then we go beneath the institutional issue to, again, the single, same, dominant selector. The main, prime, ultimate selector is whether it adds money revenues to private money sequencers. End of story.
Exactly. No, I
so
agree.
That's what's happened to the university, for example. I, come from the university. And what's happened there is basically it's all turned into money sequencing. Administration replaces the capitalist, and you can predict everything they're going to do. Does it bring more money into central administration? Then they will select for it. If it doesn't bring more money into central administration, doesn't matter how original research it is, it doesn't matter what breakthrough is happening, it will not be selected for approval. And so you have the same system has now gone into the institution of the university. The one thing that you might say is the key to the social immune system, recognizing basic underlying patterns that aren't seen on the face of things. That's what research and university and professors should be about, and indeed in some cases are, but basically that's all being selected out. And so we have the problem right in front of our eyes at the university institution level happening, and that I don't know how many people are really aware that that's what's happening to the university. Certainly this is an unspeakable within the university. Now I've been talking this a lot, and more people are talking about it. But basically, what you'll find is that the community inside the university, they have a good thing going. Each of the individuals is highly competitive. I mean, even when I got hired, there was 200 other people applying for the job that all had their PhDs, etc. Now it's even worse in the sense of just extremely competitive, and what is selected for are the people that are going to serve basically outside money sequences and bring in funding. And those people don't want to hear what you got to say. You're the enemy if you say this thing. And the people who don't want to be in it, who are, say, in a field that hasn't been completely taken over, like philosophy, they're afraid of saying anything less they might lose their job, or the administrators are going to be, because, it all has it's a systematic renewal. Every year it's thought that tenure guarantees. But, there's a basic selection process going on all the time about whether you get a raise, whether you get a promotion, whether you get so much added to your pension possibilities. Every year this is going on, and if you offend anybody inside the cabals of the system, who are all in turn basically, with noble exceptions, are all basically bound to the money sequence system, then they're just afraid it'll be hard for their career. So you basically have individual careerists, not real thinkers and researchers, but individual careerists who think also in money terms, and they're keeping their mouths shut, or their eyes shut, one or the other. And so institutions it's not just institution as such, like my friend John Ralston Saul has thought, well, the institutions are the problem. No, but you've got to go back down to what the causal mechanism behind the corruption of the institution. The same thing's going on in health, public health care, and, research or hospital account systems. It's all about how much money they bring in, and that's it. And so that starts being the selector for everything at every level. And so the one places where we had made huge breakthroughs since 1945 in particular, through science, public science, basically within public universities, and public health, medical research was basically public. That's all been privatized, and it's all privatized basically parasitic on the university and parasitic on health institutions in order to make them subjugated entirely to the private money sequence. Just as an example here of the way it could be.
Sure.
Benjamin Franklin, he talked. He was a smart fellow, and very high-ranking fellow. We all know him as a founding father, and he invented the Franklin stove. Now that was a huge money earner in the sense of him having a patent or copyright on it. He knew that was a possibility. He just refused. He said everything should enter into the public domain. That's the whole point of human progress, is that intellectual discoveries pass into the community as what's being done for. That's the way the human race has evolved. And so he didn't take, though the possibility was there, he didn't want copyright or any protection on his patent. He just wanted people to have a good stove when they didn't have a good stove. And in fact, that's what drives every researcher, really, is that they want to do something for humanity and the field basically it's the field they're in. They want to make a contribution. That's what really drives them. And, of course, all that has just been privatized in our lifetimes, This has all happened quite recently. That is basically, since the late 1980s, since all this whole system started coming in. It started working on the university, where the universities could produce their knowledge product for patent. Bob Dole was part of one of the founders of that bill, which started basically turning the universities into money machines at the same time as they withdrew public funding. Make them go. In fact, the presidents of our university joined together with the business community and called a business roundtable, and actually its acronym was BOSS. And it just, they recommended, the university presidents themselves, they recommended to governments that they reduce public funding for universities to force the researchers into serving the corporate market. They did it, along with the businessmen. And now they were doing it in Canada. That was across the country. And but they were being led by the states. The states had already done this and was moving in the same direction. Now that whole understanding of what's happened at the university, even as somebody who's a researcher like yourself, I'm not sure that you would know it, or most people do know it, but all that stuff was really rather remarkably planned. And the key is through the money sequencing itself. Everybody needs money. That's why you want to get out of the money system. Everybody needs money to survive as an institution or as an individual, and so just take away their money. Right. And then you're going to be dependent on the private money sequencers, and that's what's going on in Greece at this very moment, what the people are rebelling about. And this has actually all been planned, and that's really one of the really sinister things about it. You can see how it's quite plannable, and it has been planned. And, Rockefeller has said, David Rockefeller at the Bilderberg Institute, well, I think that an elite of bankers and I think he called them researchers or academics, I guess is what his term was. Bankers and academics are fitter to run nations than the past auto-determination of societies in past centuries.
Right,
so he said that in 1991 at the Bilderberg. It was leaked, and so his father or his grandfather was saying, well, it's a law. Poverty's a law of God. This is the way of selecting for a higher human race. So you see something that has been in play for a long time, has crystallized, and I think the real turning point came in the 1979, 1980 with Thatcher and Reagan, who were basically money sequence fanatics to decode their meaning. And they didn't think that anything existed of value other than what they call the market, but basically it's just private money sequencing. And so they forced everything to come into line with that, or you were broken, whether you were the air controller or whether you were the miners or whether you were the sociology department in universities, or didn't matter who, or whether you were Nicaragua or Costa Rica or Iraq, as it's turned out, or the formerly socialist Yugoslavia. Just break them, kill them. And that's what they did. And we're living in the after effects.
Yeah, absolutely. I interviewed prior a man named John Perkins. You might be familiar with him.
Oh, yes.
Yes, he talks very clearly about the use of debt pressure to basically break these countries and break these...
Oh, yeah, and murder, too. I mean, I was a hitman for the...
Yeah. Well, you made a great point regarding what essentially the value system disorder. The people in power are these amalgams of this distortion. And one thing that I wanted to point out in passing that you had commented on was how privatization is really the next level of this growth cancer that we have, because they have to keep spreading to different areas. So water supplies, public health, this is to be expected. Education. Yes.
Yeah, and privatization is its only way. It's all the frontiers have really been, you can't take over other people's societies so easily. You already have. You don't have anything more to take, except if it happens to be Libya or if it happens to be Iraq, and they're still taking other societies, basically, subjugating and genociding them in order to turn them into private money sequencing and then call it freedom. And that's really the inner logic of the whole system. So, but, it goes way back to the Adam Smith. I'm just going to give you a quote from Adam Smith. He says, if I can find it here, he says, and I'm just going to read something here because it's really very interesting.
Sure.
He affirms really the set point of the whole life blind system. Now, incidentally, his book, The Wealth of Nations, or inquiry into the wealth of nations. It was printed in the same year that the American Revolution occurred. I don't know if you knew that, 1776.
Okay.
And I don't think that's I think that's a sort of a historical turning point that's really huge. And he says, right, and he was a philosopher, he was a moral philosopher, and he was a good philosopher, and he was the first guy to try to understand economics, really, from philosophy, and he did a really incredible job of understanding the market system as it then existed, which, didn't really have corporations. He didn't believe in the corporation. But he said in his Wealth of Nations, very famous statement, he says, "It's an obvious and simple system of natural liberty which establishes itself of its own accord." That is the market system. And of course, there has been traditional markets, but they're a different thing than what they are now. In fact, they're the opposite. Every man, so long as he does not violate the laws of justice, and basically there's no laws of justice but market exchange itself in Smith,
right,
is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest, his own way, and the sovereign is therefore discharged from the duty, the sovereign meaning government, is discharged from the duty of superintending the industry of private people. Now that notion is very much, as you know, alive today. It's sort of proclaimed from the rooftops.
Right.
So then you say, well, that all makes sense, and it does make sense. But then you notice even in Smith, it doesn't make sense, of course, if you look deeper. But this is something that's never quoted from Smith, but what he says when he talks about the labor process. He says, when it comes to the issue of mass starvation of children, that's no problem for him. In fact, it's evolution. He had a proto-evolutionary theory. And so he said, without a blink of concern for the mass homicidal effects, he said, and this is the direct quote, that, and it was all run by an invisible hand. He was a deist. He believed in, that God had made, I don't know whether you're familiar with that notion of a deist, but what it means is the world is a perfect machine, a perfect mechanism that's made by God and is to run on its own. That's God's will, and that's called deism, and that's very much alive today, only with a vengeance. And he says, direct quote, "Among the inferior ranks of people," notice, there are inferiors. Sure. Amongst the inferior ranks of people, the scantiness of subsistence can set limits to the further multiplication of the human species, and it can do so in no other way than by destroying a great part of the children which their fruitful marriages produce. So Adam Smith had already seen the mass murder or killing of children, the mass homicide of children, as just fine. That was all part of the evolutionary process to a higher thing. So we're dealing with a value system. He knew it was a value system. That denial is just a joke. Really, it starts to happen at the turn of the 20th century when they realize that nobody can really believe in this value system. They pretend it's value neutral, which is, very much a profound, if horrible joke. But that was a cost that we're quite willing to pay. Yeah. The mass homicide of children. And there's nothing in market doctrine today, or as so-called market doctrine, there's nothing in all of the theories of economics today that rules this out. So the only thing that rules it out is a political intervention that happens through, and especially happened after the Depression and the Second World War. Political interventions happened, and people said, we're not going to go on with this. It doesn't work. They knew that, and 25% unemployment and so forth. It doesn't work. We're going to have, and Keynes was part of this, and saying you're going to have a public investor here, or you're not going to get the system working again. And so that's what happened, and we did get a lot of social things come in. We had public education, we had public health care, and on it went. And we had life security, social life security, and all the programs that they're now stripping and privatizing came in because it was recognized you can't go on killing hundreds of millions of people. You can't go on doing that. It's not right. And so the economists will pretend it's not a value system, but there it is. It's about as big a value system as you can get. It's saying a value is to prefer a principle of preference. We're going to prefer the deaths of hundreds of thousands and millions of children for money, profit, and commodity increase. That's a value judgment, and that's built right into the system. So one of the biggest problems I had in coming to this understanding over years was that is dealing with what you said, the pretense of neutrality, that this is value free, this is value neutral, and so forth. That idea, even Marx swallowed that idea. And he wanted to say there's no values involved at all. Values are just, ideological mishmash, usually behind which, so many bourgeois interests are going to ambush you. He knew something had gone terribly, terribly wrong, but he could not see that the mechanism itself was a value system and understand it, therefore, since it's a value system, it's alterable. It's a human construct. It's a social construct. Not only a social construct, but it's a social construct that runs entirely on ultimately regulating principles of preference. And the principle of preference here is to turn money into more money for private money possessors. End of story. No cost of anything else matters. And that's been going on for centuries. And we, of course, have all the genocide of the first peoples, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as, in the wake of this basically a homicidal world machine. It can't be understood this way, though, as that's just too much to face, but that's what your movement is doing, and that's what more and more people will, of course. The understanding has been intuitively available for a long time. We now understand it in principle, and we can be I can be very exact, formal. I can put it into formal notations, and the rest of it. And we do have that available to us. What we haven't really come to is an understanding that indeed it is a value system, and it's not freedom. It's actually subjugation. What it does do, though, and this is the value I think that really appeals to people, and it did at the beginning, was that it gives them commodities that were not otherwise available. I mean, that's what capitalism did, and that's why it took off. In the beginning, it was, basically sheep were the central commodity, and then it became slaves, but, both of them together. But what you produced was food and clothing through, as I say, the first primary commodity of sheep. You produced more food and clothing than was otherwise available, and you did it through this private money sequencing, where they had an incentive to organize to do this. And so for the heyday of capitalism, money capitalism, it's not really capitalism, it's not really capital, it's money sequencing. That's why I insist on those terms. Capital is wealth that produces more wealth. This doesn't produce more wealth, it produces more money demand on wealth. But at the beginning, it produced more food and clothing, and so that was the great success of capitalism, and through the organization of labor into dividing the process of production into its constituent phases and so forth. These were very, very important technological developments that produced commodities, and then at a certain point you started seeing, well, there isn't enough market room left for producing food and clothing. We're going to have to get into other things, and then with no life regulations, and any life regulations, life standards we have being removed for efficiency, that is, reduced cost for private money sequencers, then you produce anything at all. And so what we've found, as you've already observed, is what we found is that virtually every level of production, inferior products are being turned out. And because it sells well, and it's cheaper to make, and take food, which is one of the primary ones. And I think clothing probably, and things like running shoes have actually, I've certainly noticed running shoes have gotten better, but it's at the cost of a kind of slave labor and pollution and the rest of it. And so you really realize that the system, that thinks it's the most efficient system in the history of humanity is really, by objective accounting principles, is really the most systematically inefficient system in the history of humanity. But Go ahead.
Absolutely, and it appears that we are having to increase that inefficiency as time moves forward.
Yeah.
And this brings us to a later question that I commented on regarding this advanced movement of growth in technology and science, where we're able to automate so much now, displacing the labor force at increasing rates. So what does that mean? It means we have to find more jobs, more things to produce for people, and it's the sickness of it all. To me, I mean, everyone now has bottled water. Even pollution becomes a profitable thing. Any problems become profitable.
Well,
we want to service things. We don't want to resolve anything.
No, because as you've pointed out, if you destroy the life goods in nature in the community and by your own system of, say, carcinogenic inputs into foods and so forth, then you create a new market demand for other products to deal with what you just created as a problem. So it's what I called long ago a death spiral, and that language, one of our leading political scientists at a learned conference who was discussing the book, he says, this is prophecy, and he didn't mean it positively. He meant, I had gone over the edge in the sense of describing this thing by calling it a death spiral. And I said, well, actually, just look at the mechanics of its cumulative movement and outcomes. And it does. And the more it creates destruction and despoliation of lives, the more it creates new market demands for something to respond to these problems. And one of the biggest things it's produced is, in the way of despoliation of people's lives, is cancer itself.
Right.
And cancer itself, as we know, grows and grows and grows. And though they find ways of treating it. Now, those ways they have of treating it are new markets for new goods, for new pharmaceuticals, for new surgical instruments, for new, the whole HMO, Health Maintenance Organization business is the hugest in the world. It's 14% of your product, of your whole GDP. Well, it's all based on basically treating the symptoms and bad effects, deleterious effects, disease-causing effects of the products themselves and the processes of production. So long ago, people like Samuel Epstein, who's written on these matters, for example, in Cancergate, recognized that, the real cancer, the cancer that's being produced is not being examined. All we're going down is looking at the victims. We're looking at the individual life hosts that are afflicted with it, and it's a terrible, terrible disease. Awful. And so what all you're doing is treating the victims, and you're not looking at the cause of it. Well, we know through research has increasingly shown that over 85, maybe over 90% of all the cancers are environmentally induced, whether it's tobacco or carcinogens, or not tobacco, really those concoctions that they put that are full of poison. You know what that? Yeah, I mean, the reason people get a hit out of smoking is it's a chemical threat to the body. The body goes into an immune system alarm at what has been introduced, all these toxins, and all the toxins that are in there. I mean, paint thinner, every kind of thing is in there, is in order to deliberately stimulate the immune system into an alarm response, and that's the high from smoking. And so that breaks down the body if you do it, not either through the toxins or through the problem with, everything that does when you just keep alarming the immune system in this way. And so it breaks down. And so now, well, no problem. We've just got HMOs and we've got everything to take care of that. And what the Cancer Institute will never do is discuss the environmental causes of cancer.
Right.
And so you just have a reproductive cycle that just grows and grows.
There's no address of any core problems at all. For to do so would pretty much void the basic mechanisms of the system we have. To bring this down to a very concentrated train of thought, what we have, and tell me if you agree or not, we have a value system disorder that has been born out of a system that's basically transmutated itself from very simple market exchange. And then with the advancement of technology, we've been displacing labor. We find the need for more and more new jobs. We have a growth paradigm that's emerged. We're using debt. So it feels to me that the majority of the problems and the train of thought that goes through the corporations, the circular reasoning, all of this is born out of a core systemic concept that is basically not applicable or not efficient, obviously, but not socially viable, not life ground viable. Do you feel that
logical? Yeah.
Exactly, but do you feel it's sourced at the very core, or do you feel that it could be salvaged, the market system could be salvaged to support the life ground as you see it?
Well, that is I think that we can do things that can turn it around overnight if we decide to. And
right.
For example, the way I was discussing, when we had that financial crash, and it showed that the financial system so-called financial system was not working because it's a pure money sequencing system that's exploitative, et cetera, then we had the issue of housing and inability to provide a money exchange system whereby people can have houses without being broken, and that we can have a financial system that can continue to exist without completely collapsing people's lives with it. So if we just responded ad hoc, to the problems as they were created, we could, supposing what I'd said had happened, that just said, well, we're going to take over the funding of housing. This is within government's purview. We have the constitutional grounds to do this, and the system has failed, and we just simply must have a remedy. And if they had done that, then we really would have had a very, very important turn at the center of the system.
Sure.
With carbon, one worries a bit that they're putting all the problems of ecocide, and basically it's an ecocidal system. It's destroying ecological reproduction at virtually every level. I mean, just think of the species. The species are going extinct at 1,000 times, and people are now saying 2,000 times the background evolutionary rate. It's, and the word is, they use extinction spasm. So we have an extinction spasm going on here, and we also have destabilized our hydrological and climate cycles. I never say that. Of course, they call it under euphemisms like global warming. We'll introduce life standards that ensure we don't go on doing that. And you could
say that. Right,
you could bring life standards by putting it right inside these trade and investment diktats by corporations who write all the terms, and they're the only rights that are protected there are of money investors. The only rights protected in any of this international machinery. It's quite an amazing fact. Thousands of pages protect nobody's rights to anything except their rights to have profit and money, and they can sue governments if they don't have it. Just put in, as they already did, and so the only term that protects anything is that you have the ozone layer, and that the ozone layer protocol is something that a government can make a decision in light of that they can't be sued for infringing upon the corporate's opportunities of profit. They just say, oh, well, it's not just the ozone layer in trouble here. We have a species extinction spasm that's in trouble. We have a climate destabilization, and we know the causal mechanisms, and so we just put in terms. We've developed instruments at the international level to reduce the amount of, say, carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. And the way you do it is just say, I'm sorry, you can't bring your good into this province, into this country. You can't export your good across borders unless it complies with trade regulations. And these trade regulations include life protective protocols. And and you put it right at the beginning. So they have an incentive. Either they conform and comply, or they don't export. And of course, the whole thing is being now driven by the exports, and capital can't make its profits. Now, of course, that makes perfect sense. But why haven't we heard more about it? And the real point here I'm saying is that we could turn it around really very quickly if you had any kind of real leadership happening at the top, and we haven't. So instead of just saying let's get rid of money altogether as I know, I can understand that advocacy. We rather speak to the problems that we now have that are huge. They are lethal, deadly, world,
Sure.
It's the whole world's involved here. We speak to those problems in a sensible way, and we introduce life standards, and we introduce for example, with respect to, all the problems that are from the processes and products of our money sequencing production system. And then let people adapt. Now, we have done this in the past, and it has worked. So what has happened is all that stuff that we've done in the past, which has worked, has been rolled back and stripped back and eliminated, and it's in the process. All this crisis is, they just, instead of solving the problem, they just advance, like Naomi Klein says in her Disaster Capitalism, they just use the disaster they've created as the reason to make it more totalitarian and life-destructive than before. And that's the actual modus operandi that's quite documentable, and she's done a great job of documenting it.
Well, I completely agree with the transitional steps and the urgency of where we are today, but don't you feel from a more or less a philosophical perspective that the state intervention is really an attempt to thwart natural tendencies of what this system has turned into being? And with that train of thought, wouldn't it, at the very core, and this is why we advocate with our removal of the monetary system, getting straight to resource distribution, removing the mechanisms of profit, total earth management to understand what we have, what we're doing. Don't you feel that such an approach in the end game, if you will, is really where we should be headed, to just get away from the mechanisms and the tendencies and essentially the value system disorder that's manifest?
Yeah, it's just, we've tried the sort of all or nothing approach has been tried, now not the way you're describing it. And what we find is that unexpected, unintended consequences occur. So for Marx, he thought that, if we just had the working class ownership, which would basically turn out in a way as public ownership, but we have working class collective ownership of the means of production, then and we need to do that, we're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, but that's needed. We've had dictatorships before, etc. And then we got an abortion like the Soviet system coming out of that. And I use the term abortion sort of deliberately. Marx talked about the birth pangs of society producing a new order, and he really understood it as a wholly new life organization coming into play. And if you look over history, basically it's more a stitch-by-stitch process, though I've often been, very impressed by revolutionary, but how many of them actually have worked when you tried to do everything at once? Better work with what you've got, with the ideals. You see, the value. We're not disagreeing on any values here,
right?
And that's you're right. That's the key, and that's the basis. That's the ultimately regulating system of the whole global structure. And it's what basically, I think it's by rules. Humans are the rule-making creature. I mean, that's what distinguishes us from the animals, who are basically confined to their instinctual repertoires and sequences. And they can't, they don't have rules, basically. And we were able and have been able, that's basically distinguished us, we've been able to make rules either implicitly or explicitly to regulate us. And we've made rules of every kind. Rules that actually are good, like you can't go killing members of your community or disabling them. You can't take away people's means of continued existence from them because you want it, etc. We have all, even rules against, fraudulent and lying behavior and so forth. All our successes have been based on good rules, and I just say that the rules are always of one type or another. They always serve the life sequence. They protect life, or they enable life in ways that weren't possible without the rules. And we continue on. We've got a bad rule system now, and we have to reset the rule system in order to protect and enable human and ecological life, what we're dependent on. And then it's a matter of how we do that, and where do we move first? Well, I say we move first on those areas which are most disastrous if we don't move first. It's telling us where we must move first by the disaster that's being constructed here. And now, of course, you maybe, when you say, well, we can make this all a technically manageable system where we know, instead of going through the exchange medium, I understand the argument, we don't go through the exchange medium, we know this family needs such, and such, they're already ordering things on their computers and so forth, we know what education the kids need, to access the public schools, and the thing is to get clear on what are real means of life that we can assign to allocate. So the principle of allocation is everything here. And you're saying, well, let's just skip the money exchange and allocate where it's needed. And I would say two things here. Let's be very careful about what we understand what's needed. I can give a criterion of what's needed, and let's see what we're working with already to see if we can reset what we've already evolved to be, to provide that life productive and life enabling possibility for the life sequence of value for the planet. And so you work with what you've got.
Sure.
So says, it's the longest journey has its first step. So we work with what we got. Now, it may be that we eventually go that way. I mean, basically, my life and your life, I don't know. It's just basically, it's all technologically allocated because of what I've earned in the past, and through, various, in my case, I have a pension fund, and it just automatically ducks. I don't have to do, in fact, I hardly do any money exchanging anymore. So I realize the possibility. But to get there, knowing what the real needs are, the life protective and life enabling needs are, and what the criterion is, it's quite simple and it works with everything. People are always saying it's part of our problem. You can't tell the difference between a need and a desire. One person's want is another person's, etc. Well, you can. It just is that without which life capacity is reduced. That's always what a need is, and nothing else but that is a need. And so you work from there, and you just say, well, how can we technically manage this so that people get what they need? But you also, the money thing too has been an incentive. In order for people to do what needs to be done, they have to work for pay. Is really I think that's almost the ultimate selling point of the system that even Cuba's coming around to. That no longer says Raul Castro can we say that Cuba is a place where you don't have to work, and so they're going to, God help them, they're going to the system and relying on the money as an incentive to get people to do the work that must be done, otherwise they won't do it. And that's the ultimate selling point of the system. And how are you going to get around that? I myself have never worked for the money of it. I think most people, who have jobs they really contribute to, it's not really the issue. But for a lot of people it is. And
well, in the culture that we have now, and I know you have to go very soon, so I'll be very brief. In the culture we have, obviously the monetary incentive has been deeply drilled into them, and it's in fact decoupled incentive because it's for monetary gain as opposed to sustenance of life or actually filling needs. Yeah. And I think, there could be a lot of arguments made with respect to what a new incentive system could be in a society that was organized to actually take care of its populace as opposed to kind of competitive nature that we have. One thing I also want to comment on, you talk about the immediate need for there to be very, very deliberate actions, which I completely agree with, against the severe problems that are emerging. But as I think, I know the government institution really is an extension of this monetary sequence, and it's so hard, obviously, to get them to do anything, which is where we get this sort of the need for the rise of the grassroots immune system. So I guess there's a certain cynicism with respect to using the state legislatures because all it takes, again, is a new administration to come in and overturn it, and since it's still driven by money. So these are all important questions that we often talk about, which continues to lead our train of thought to the new rule system, as you point out, which is the new social structure based on resource management, deriving those values from nature itself. as opposed to sort of building upon arbitrary rule sets that, historically have existed.
Well,
and
not building, I use the language, I agree with you, it shouldn't be building on because
Sure.
they need to be reset.
Well, that's what happens now, unfortunately, but I agree with you. Exactly. They do need to be reset. They should be
for
based
example, the example, the ones I've given, that we can reset. We have had that. It used to be, for example, the government, up until about 1970, there were no, foreign investment was basically through government loans, public loans. The rebuilding of Europe was under complete public control in order for it to work. And that did actually work. So we have a long track record of being able to do this. It's just that it's all been stripped away through this magic thinking theo-capitalism.
Right.
And so it's not the state, especially in the United States, it's an interesting thing. There seems to be a great suspicion of the state with good reason. But the state has been capable of doing good things too. And for example, Roosevelt's New Deal, for example, the sorts of things that came out of that, even though it's all been stripped back, where you have basically life security for people and employment for people, it can go one way or another. There's an evil state, which I'm sorry that we're into now, basically just a corrupt money sequencing state for private individuals who are at the trough. And we can have a good public instead of even thinking of it as a state. In fact, the sorts of solutions I'm depending are suprastate solutions. That is, through these trade and investment agreements, so-called, they're treaties, and they require everybody to comply with them. Well, we've seen that works. That's the first time we've been able to cross borders and see that it works. And now we have the possibility of saying, well, let's put some good rules in there. And that really is suprastate. But we need the rules, and we need the rules to be life protective and life enabling rather than basically promoting money sequencing as the sole objective of the planet.
Right, exactly. And I would just say comment that the rules should be derived from, should basically be explicit to a system approach.
Yeah.
An approach that actually mirrors the way the world actually works, of course. All the things that make sense to you and I, as far as, we should know how much we have. We should use our scientific understanding to allocate resources properly. We should make goods that last. When all that stuff's put together, it seems to me and to many that are listening that there's a certain sort of self-evident nature, if you will, to what kind of natural system could emerge based on where we are today, based on where technology is, and then the rules would be derived from that. And I just want to clarify one thing with you, is that we're not really trying to advocate a quantum leap into something in an immediate sense. We're trying to depict and understand what the future could be, what these values support, what science technology teaches us, what our human needs really are, and try to just get the public to understand that if we could just maneuver our way and approach that, that's the direction we should go.
To go along with exactly what you're saying, to make clear where we're already past the money system, the private money exchange system. We're already past it in all the things that count, almost, and they're stripping it back. But the thing that matters most, and I've noticed this living, I've traveled around the world, I've lived backpacked around the world and swam in the bloodstreams of the people through almost 100 countries. And I've also lived off the grid for years of my life. You need water supply.
Right.
You need sewers. Who's charging you a price to turn your tap on or flush your toilet? Nobody's charging you a price. You pay, at the end of the year, you contribute whatever it is that of the inputs or outputs that you absorb. But basically, it's nothing like what it's worth to you. We've already moved past the money system with water supply. In fact, that's really what the modern civilization is based upon, between modern water supply and sewer systems. Already past it. I've also got to have something that interests me. Well, libraries with the books that we read. Well, I've got to be able to get around and walk around. Well, sidewalks. Who's out there, demanding money for me to be on the sidewalk or selling futures in it? we have already found what works beyond the money system, and it's all being stripped away from us. So I think yes, indeed. But you might say that you can go back to your ground, and I don't know whether you remember the concept. I call it the civil commons, and it's just basically civil institutions and language itself as its first form that provide a life good that's universally accessible. However you do it, it's a universally accessible and needed life good. Exactly. And we have done that to a huge extent. So you use that, what I call a civil commons model, as, well, first of all, you've got to hold on to what you've got because they're taking it as fast as they can. And second of all, extend it, so that we now, et cetera.
Well, therein lies, and this will be the final point because I know you have to go, and we're reaching the end of the program itself, and I appreciate you extending your stay here. But the advancement of technology, there's so many automated systems now that could literally provide an abundance of food. So just like we had the water, just like we have the sidewalk, we can see that if we had the right focus with our ingenuity, we could easily begin to provide things with no cost, with very little labor contribution. And that's the sort of train of thought that we're trying to move forward with, to create an abundance, an access abundance to meet the needs of the human population and alleviate so many of the unnecessary pressures. And this is sort of the direction that we talk about in the movement. But I'd love to have you back on soon, and we can talk more about this if you have time, John. I really appreciate it.
We have a lot of depth. No, it's been very enjoyable, Peter, and the questions you pose are very good ones.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate it. Anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, except keep on going.
Thank you.
And I think the act of understanding is the primary act.
Yeah, absolutely. What can we do if people don't understand?
Yeah,
we have a whole society of people that really don't understand.
Yeah,
I think that's really the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not allowed to understand. It's basically kept off. I mean, I don't have a television set, for example. I don't buy any of the media with advertising in it because I know I'm not going to be able to understand through those media.
Yeah.
And so the act of understanding is really all, because once the understanding and what is possible and how we do it that is self-evident, that it isn't going to be based on any command system, is what it is self-evident, and this is the way we need to move.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. Take
My
care,
pleasure. John. Bye for now.
Okay. Goodbye. Dr. John McMurtry, I really appreciate him coming. We have 2 more minutes left in the show. I'm going to conclude now, and I'll be happy to bring John back on. He's a tremendously good thinker. And if you aren't familiar with his work, I definitely recommend The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. You kind of have to be familiar with some of the language and terminology that he's brought up. Sometimes it might seem a little foreign. He's got a tremendous intellectual capacity, but very much a big ally in what we talk about. And I'll leave it at that for now. I hope everyone is doing well out there, and we'll be back next week with more work. I think maybe even Federico or Tom might be on, but we'll see how it goes. Take care, everybody.